the slides. We're kind of busy, and I actually wanted to introduce a bit, but I think we'll skip the part on the business rationale. I guess most will know that anyways. But briefly on the topic today, in 4 sections, we'll be looking into a few of the basic concepts as to how is an individual constituted, what happens in relations, and what actually happens in multi-agent systems. We'll also be sensitizing a sort of an overview, also relating to the Wortley maps in the last part of that section. The next part is constructing, what should we say, a complete view of the law, regulation, compliance against ethics, and also looking into what is actually the normative cascade and how could that be viewed as an anticipation tool also, and relating to definitions of soft and hard ethics. And finally also some tools on what is ethical foresight and ethical impact assessment. In section 3 we will we'll have a look at another concept from Floridi called infraethics, and how that fits into what in Wortley maps are known as, I guess, the game, but also the dual advantage of thinking along the lines of soft ethics. And finally, we'll try and see if we can put it all together in a rather busy model, you might say. Also including the basics of the Wortley maps from Sun Tzu and from Boyd, the ODA loop also. It's a bit of I guess a different approach to this. I'm a trained engineer. I'm also previously been an army officer and have a master's in philosophy, but also a master's in IT strategy and organization. And from a information philosophy perspective, what is this Wortley map thing about? What is this strategy about? And basically, you could say it's an attempt to reduce information entropy and increase semantic information, meaning understanding the environment you are in. So reducing complexity and increasing understanding. So from an ethical point of view, that is a positive thing, at least when we talk about information ethics, where limiting entropy is a decisive thing. I hope you still see my screen. I'm just gonna move it a bit here. So section number 1. A nice little quote from Floridi, and I actually think if you were attending Wortley's intro, this is some sort of the basic stuff, as he also mentions about the on the maps and the graphs, where we say models are the medium, but they are not the message. They are reflections of what you say real life systems, and only expressions thereof. They are not the content, in other words, and that plays a huge role in information philosophy and information ethics. So when we move into looking at this from the human perspective, you might say we could claim that the playing field is more or less like this when we look at the what should we call it, the constitution that any given person or human are situated in. We are in some culture, there's some climate, and there's an environment. From a personal perspective, we behave in certain ways based on certain norms that is kind of formed out of the virtues that we have, which is based on the values. the most core of them are the ethical values, and basically actually four core abstract concepts from Greek philosophy of the good, the just, the true, and the beautiful. And on the far right, you see I have put habits, attitudes, and beliefs. These are often unconscious and also to a certain extent built on what we could call heuristics. And they're very, very difficult to change. So this is kind of a really rough picture of each and every one of us, our constitution. The core abstracts is actually from Greek philosophy, and this is stolen from Olaf Kirkeby, and they are governed by two things. Phronesis, which would equate what we could call practical wisdom. So one thing is being wise, another thing is being practically wise. And perhaps the most, what should we say, basic concept in human life is freedom. In management consultancy language, we would normally talk about autonomy, also relating to agile or DevOps or whatever model or method we are talking about. And now it becomes a bit, maybe a little bit quirky, because each of us have our own axiology, and this is just an example of how the just or justice actually in a person can be interpreted as either open-heartedness or mercilessness. And of course, this is the individual, but when we put two individuals together, we will see these, should we call them conflicts or tensions, when we talk about dual agent systems. And then, of course, when we move in and talk about organizations, the picture becomes even more complex. So the MAS or multi-agent systems, it's a highly complex thing to figure out what people will do, how they'll do it, and why they'll do it, because we all have this as kind of a foundation. Moving into dual agent systems, where we have relations, Aristotle is still the father of this particular domain, and we still build on these three types of relationships that we can have. He mainly talks about a utility, and we'll talk about in business transactions, right? I'll give you something if you will give me something else. Then he talks about pleasure, maybe a little bit more mature relationships, where we could also talk about we actually enjoy being together without having to transact all the time. And then the highest level, which would be built on what is a good and a good life, where we actually don't have to exchange anything. We are just in the relation for the relation itself, you might say. So the idea is that reciprocity becomes less important over time and over building the relationship, and what we could call mutuality is instead increasing. So forming a model around this would look something like this, very simplified. We have a number of types of trust. You know, the spontaneous trust you can actually have with a more or less strange person. Then we have the codified trust level, most well known with the contracts, for instance. We have the realistic trust, where there's still an element of, or at least a consciousness about being the potentiality of being deceived. And then you have a genuine trust, or what we could call a prototypic trust of I don't know, friends you've had for 25 years. The relations is typically in three different types of either transactional, where we exchange something, Then we have the transmissional area, which can both move back, you might say, down to the transactional, the most simple relationship you can have, or you can actually move into a sphere of what we could call transformational relationships. Those relationships where you actually interact on a higher level of trust, and do not necessarily expect an return for each encounter, you might say. And why is this relevant? Actually, for a lot of reasons, it's about how we actually interact and interface with the world and with each other. And from an, what should we say, a way of reducing, as also the Wortley maps, entropy, you might say, as Niklas Luhmann, who claims that trust is actually a complexity reduction tool. In the sense, I think most obvious is the contract, where we kind of take uncertainty out of the equation by formalizing it. And this complexity reduction is, of course, important. One thing is the competition, which we also talk a lot about in Wortley maps, but also the co-opetition, but also co-development, you might say, where we aim to reduce complexity and smooth and create flow. So if we kind of put this into a more commercial landscape, it becomes a little bit complex, I know. It's a fairly basic slide. As the basic model, you design what you're in control of. The market will design you if you don't, and if you don't act at all, you will entirely be designed. It's actually very simple. I put it in with the enterprise and the commercial area and the political area to actually showcase this is kind of the landscape and climate that we move in. And what we control or not control is our leadership and our doctrine, where we decide on this. And of course, the why of purpose, our moral imperative, is kind of the core of this of these relations. And then we have on the right side the relations and the interface. This is actually how we not only interact but also influence with other agents or other people or other organizations. The important thing here is to, at least I think, to remember is that we may say that organizations are interacting, and they are also interacting, but it will always be on a person-to-person level. It is never at an entire organization who interacts with another organization. To kind of get into to the normative and ethical, I put in a couple of examples of the why movement, because it's going to be important once we start to put together the final model. As we see over time, there's all areas change, right? And a lot of it is actually due to, we could also call it public opinion, but there's a normative or ethical shift in how we perceive, whether it's products, services, or you might say how we actually interact with each other. Scientific management, servant leadership, quite different ethical values that they stand on. This happens over time, and it's kind of like also what is encompassed in the Wortley maps, where we are more talking about components and products. Okay. You probably already kind of sensed it, but it's a kind of constructionist approach to figuring out how does information philosophy and information ethics potentially fit into Wortley maps and the mapping, but also what kind of value, you might say, or benefit would we get out of it on a more practical term also relating to strategy. And the idea here is, of course, that we are not describing or prescribing, we are inscribing knowledge, and now we are doing it into an existing model with other existing models, what could be called conceptual design. But let's jump into it. We have already used way too much time. The normative cascade, nothing new in this. I touched upon it also. There will be a shift over time from norms and ethics, and a few examples in here also from classic example from IT transformation into digital transformation, from being a things philosophy or something you put in and put power on, to being a organizational topic, being a relational philosophy. The same with stockholder and stakeholder management. I think most know about that one. Looking into Floridi and his, as we say, revisit of ethics and dividing it into hard and soft ethics. It's not that they're different; they're actually the same. Normally, hard ethics is a precursor for law, compliance, and regulation, whereas soft ethics is post-compliance ethics, meaning after the hard ethics and the law, then there will be a period of time where, as we say, what we are able to do in general in the world, feasibility, what is feasible, will increase. But it will not be covered solely by hard ethics or regulation. It'll be more a soft ethics. So we will talk about what is actually possible in, what we say, parallel with the development. So that's kind of the idea behind this. My conclusion is that it is also then pre-compliance ethics, because it kind of forms the next step in the hard ethics. I haven't really gotten a sign-off from Floridi, but maybe I will one day. But this is a basic idea. So the soft ethics is mainly concerned with what is now and in the future, and what is actually possible to do. Just a brief model to kind of illustrate the idea here with governance being on top, because all of these things needs to be governed in organizations, and they have some limitations and constraints due to the regulations. But as we know with the law, there's two things. There's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. And when we move into the spirit of the law, then we are also entering into the domain of ethics, both soft and hard. Just copied this nice little model to kind of illustrate Floridi's model is on human rights and compliance. And if we abstract it, we could say that it's about rights and duties. And then we have the space of soft ethics that is based on what is feasible today and tomorrow and next year, and what is not contained, you might say, or constrained by the law or hard ethics. So this is kind of the space of soft ethics. When we then move into the foresight, because it's also about anticipation and prediction, then the very simple cycle, and it's not unique, I think, to ethics. It's kind of a thing we do with all future things. Is the debating the future, and I have a slight error here, I see. We do this on technology, we do it on the social stuff, we do it on just about anything in life, I guess. We are debating what we're going to do tomorrow, and then we are moving into also considering projecting the future here also around what is feasible. And finally, if we're really lucky, we are also going to shape the future, either via interaction directly by ourselves, or through some sort of influence. So we analyze, we kind of diagnose, synthesize, and attempt to influence, relating also to the Wortley map model. Try to figure out what kind of analogy or metaphor that could kind of be used for this, because ethics is, as we saw in one of the first slides, on the playing field. It's kind of core. Your ethical values is what you stand on. It's what you develop your virtues on and your norms, and actually can be reflected in both back and forth in your behavior. So when we kind of do trend spotting or whatever we will, we are observing the surface. We are observing things that happen right now, and it would be with some sort of causal explanation as to why, for instance, why does people not buy as many fur coats as they did 30 years ago? But this kind of shift is actually happening a lot sooner or earlier than when we actually observe it in the behavior, and it's what we also see as the normative or ethical shift in what is acceptable socially. So that has a rather huge impact if you look at it in the infosphere. How does this move, and how does it move globally? Because one thing is what happens in Asia is not the same as in Europe. So there's also geographical and cultural differences. We're not going into that today, but it is definitely worth mentioning, I think. But if we look at the core, then we are talking about the hypercenter, meaning where the tensions are actually arising. And they are with the major shifts, typically also with the environment or sustainability or energy or climate, and these things, of course, are formed by what is happening in the world, and then a mind shift or a normative shift in people's way of thinking about what do I do with my waste. Knowing about these or predicting them or anticipating these types of events is then a precursor to the epicenter, but also in this analogy, maybe we should call it predicting where the fault line will be in the future. So it's a strategic, let's call it contemplation, about where is certain areas of the infosphere or the world going ethically and from a normative perspective. Hope it makes a little bit of sense. I see I have actually a question over here. The S in the OODA loop is actually sensing. Originally, the OODA loop was called sensing and orient and so on, but it would it was just look stupid, so we could call it the soda loop, and that so I guess Boyd, he decided, no, let's not do that. Let's call it observe instead.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm running double machines here because the browser is playing tricks on me. When we move in now to the ethical impact assessment, I think if we look at it really pragmatic, so this particular model as a view from product development, ideation, or design, or service design, or whatever we want to do, and we can share the level of abstraction or the perspective we lay upon this model in different ways. We'll see that in the end. Spend way too much time now. The idea is, of course, the first thing we look actually feasible. Now we're in the realm of soft ethics. The next evaluation would be, is it sustainable? And then the third level would be, is it commonly acceptable from an ethical and normative perspective? And then we are left with a few choices, and then we have to figure out what is then the preferable choice that we will make. So it's fairly simple. Of course, it's from an ethical point of view, you will have to kind of wrap around the ethical theories, right? But you would also have to get the ethical discussions, as we saw with the cycle, into play to discuss that and predict, or try to predict. And here the interesting thing from soft ethics is that the sphere, you might say, of feasibility, or the feasible, will expand over time. And we see this with machine learning, AI, the metaverse. We also, as Wortley he mentioned, also see it a lot with agriculture, for instance. Things change, and in different ways, in different cultures, in different geographies. I think it's fair to say that there's a slight difference between at least parts of the ethics and norms that pertains, for instance, to Europeans and to parts of Asia. It's not necessarily the same. The four abstract concepts are more or less the same. They can be interpreted a little bit different here and there, but more or less the same. So the idea here is actually to use this type of thinking, the soft ethics, the foresight cycle, and then the assessment to anticipate what is going to happen, also from an ethical and normative point of view. Because it is feasible to build a car that runs on nuclear energy, no doubt about it. Of course, we can do that. It might even be considered sustainable. I'm thinking at this point in time, it's definitely not acceptable. And personally, I think it's definitely not preferable. Cool. Yeah, we're moving a bit too fast here because I kind of screwed up the browser thing. I didn't know about that. So you're going to have to bear with me just. And if you have any questions, I will check double screening here and just let me know, right? Or otherwise, you can have my contact info later. Briefly looking into a phenomenon or concept called infraethics. What does this mean actually for the game part in the Wortley model? And what is this weird thing called the dual advantage of soft ethics? Man, that's far out, but it isn't. It actually makes a lot of sense. The point is, we have a few nice examples of ethical, you might say, ethical disasters, right? I think the most well-known is Cambridge Analytica. That's maybe didn't went all too well on that one, but there's a number of also Ford had a car that had a tendency to explode, and were really, really late at fixing these things, even though they knew them. So messing with what is ethically acceptable can be a costly thing. Very simple, actually, defined by Floridi, and as the not yet ethical framework. I'm thinking, what the hell is he talking about? Pertaining to expectations and attitudes, also the practices, in order to promote certain moral decisions and actions. And you could actually say that the foresight cycle, the impact assessment, is part of this infraethics, understood as an ethical infrastructure. And I think Maria Rosaria Tadeo makes a really, really nice comment or quote here around trust, respect, loyalty. It could be a number of things. It could be solidarity and other things, because they are all present, right? It's we can grab them, each one of us, no problem. And as she states, it's of course important for now she says marriage, but any relation, that we have a healthy infrastructure and interaction. But essentially, what is understood here is that this type of infrastructure is neutral, because the other example here is that the mafia also uses terms like trust and respect and loyalty to a large extent. So it's about figuring out how do we commit to an infrastructure or infra-ethics based on good moral values, you might say. Moving a bit along here. If we just revert briefly into the Wortley map, we have the leadership part, which is the moral imperative, kind of indicating at the core of all of this lies the ethics and the moral of the individual as a first order. So how we then commit to ethical values, we have the four core abstract concepts, does matter. It does actually matter how we play the game, but it also matters what kind of game we play, you might say. And here enters also the dual advantage of soft ethics as an opportunity strategy in the sense of ethical foresight, predicting and anticipating the future from a business and product service development point of view, is an enormous opportunity to be able to sense, you might say, what happens ethically and normatively in the infosphere. And secondly, it has its own little function as a risk management system, you might say, because it'll equally tell you when you do the analysis and the sensing what will be, what should we say, not preferable and not acceptable. So kind of, we have the Cambridge Analytica here again. What kind of path do you not want to take, at least to minimize your risk and potential costs? I know it's fast. I hope we can make it. Very briefly on the ethics as a service, and then to look at the synthesization of all these things into the Wortley map. Ethics as a service, for those who know a little bit about software as a service, it could also be platform as a service, it could be a lot of things, infrastructure as a service. Maybe it's best compared to platform as a service, where you kind of rent part of your platform, right, and then you can act as you like on other parts of the platform. So it's actually a provision, you might say, of ethical assistance to go into, could be the strategic analysis of predicting what is the ethical foresight. It could also be concretely on assessing ethical impact of a given product in its life cycle, because that's kind of important here. So that's what is meant with ethics as a service. Right now it's really new, and I think right now the model is there's some external help. You are buying the platform as a service, and then of course you would also have an internal governance around ethical issues, and also what could you say, consultants services to tie this together, and maybe even external audit boards, depending on of course what kind of product services are you working with. This is also from an organizational perspective, you might say, if we think about the infra-ethics and how we commit, and we talk about organizational culture, climate, environment, and what kind of organizational values, and maybe even talking about having an organizational ethos. It could also be seen in that perspective as to what are then the foundational values, and what does it actually mean if we remember the axiology. That's one thing, but also the playing field. The values is directly linked into behavior. Moving a bit on. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, this nice little model could easily be used in product assessment, right? Feasibility, sustainability, acceptability, and preferability. I think the real value here, and also combined with people who really know about ethics, is to both have the ethical assessment, but also the business assessment. The business assessment also contains marketing, it contains market analysis, competitive analysis, and all of these functions. But in order to minimize risking sending a product onto the market that is not optimal, let's just say that, but maybe also looking towards what is actually, where are we actually moving as a world or a geography, right? What are the norms, the ethics, and what is acceptable and preferable? And again, just a note there that the infra ethics is actually, it is just water pipes, right? They're kind of neutral. If there's, as Floridi writes, if there's rust in them, the water will decay and be ruined. So it does really matter how you commit to the infra ethics. What kind of values do you commit to in your business? And now it becomes even worse, you might say, more hectic. Last slide, but it is an attempt to compile what we ran through way too fast, and try and situate it in relation to the Wortley map, which is at the center or the core of the Wortley methodology, with the Sun Tzu and the OODA loop, or SODA loop, if we want to. That's also an option. And then also try to situate each of these elements, and where do they fit in? What could they actually do for you, and could you benefit from them, and where in the model would it potentially make sense? And this is also one of the reasons why the entire trust and relationship element was also in this presentation, because if we don't interact with anybody, there will be no product, there will be no business, there'll be no organization, and blah, 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 blah. Martin Buber all over again, right? So that's kind of why. I'll share the material, and there's also a lengthy reference list for those who would be interested in some of this. And I'll also make sure that my contacts information will be shared also. I'm not sure how or why, where, but I will figure it out somehow, I guess. Sorry again for the hiccup with the browser. I hope.
No, I have been listening. I have been hearing your conversation really well, and the visualization of the slides were pretty good. So it was really well. I have a question about the infra ethics.
Yes.
Well, your comments that you were talking about the negative situation with Cambridge Analytica, and how all these platforms are being built, and there are so many questions also in companies as Google, where they are discussing about the long term, about what they want to build, and where are the borders about that they don't want to cross, or that suddenly they are crossing, and that 15 years ago they have clear that they didn't want to cross those borders. So Is there any, and there is also something really interesting that I have learned about how machine learning, it's introducing a lot of bias because the training data sets are biased by themselves. So sometimes the machine learning product doesn't detect some type of things because in reality, it was not taking into account some ethics in the training data sets. So what I see is that infra ethics, it's a question that for some big platforms, I understand that internally they have these questions, but that externally it's still something really unknown or in its genesis.
I think you're right. There's a lot of effort, especially when in the AR, or machine learning and machine learning robotics, for that matter, efforts to try and build some sort of, what should we say, models to handle ethics, because we are seeing at least the past 10 to 20 years, maybe even further back, a lot of new ethical topics or issues popping up due to these technologies. This is also why we talk about information ethics and what is de facto life in the infosphere, not in the biosphere anymore, because it's two very different ontologies of what it actually means to be or be in existence, you might say. And there's a huge struggle on this. I have a brief note on one of the slides also that maybe we need a few more ethics officers in some of these large companies. Some of them have hired. They have also hired external help. Floridi worked for Google in an ethics board. And then you have the external part, right? You would expect that Deloitte or PricewaterhouseCoopers, McKinsey, whomever have you, would, and they are also offering some, but some sort of auditing mechanism that would be an external part that would then relate into what we would denominate the law or regulation compliance. But there's a lot of gaps, you might say. So it's still a new realm of development, and the hard ethics discussion, you might say, that leads into the regulation part is fed from a soft ethics discussion that we see in these years, where the feasibility kind of outgrows the ethical discourse, because it's not a linear thing, right? It kind of I would almost say explodes.
Diffusion. It has different diffusion layers, and then it will evolve with different.
Yes, because it's also a question of what is. I'm saying absorbed. That's probably not the right word, but what is being put into application by the users, right? And then we see privacy issues, a lot of those. We see the bias issue, which is maybe the most well known because we use biased data. Of course, we get biased programming. That's kind of an obvious thing. So also developments in actually having AI itself checking through for certain biases in the data sets before these data sets are then applied into, as you talk about, machine learning, is also ongoing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Per.
Thank you. I hope we managed to go through the whole shebang. I'm sorry about the technical problems, and I guess we'll find out where we share the materials. There'll also be a set of work notes for this.
I don't know. I don't know the other attendings, but I have learned a lot, and this perspective it's quite new for me. And so I have taken some notes and questions in my notebook that I need to work on later. So thank you so much.
Thank you all, and then have a continuous nice day and a nice weekend.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.